Hello. So we continue talking about transactions demand for money. And in the previous video, we agreed on the Baumol's inventory model. In its initial case, we found the equilibrium or the optimal transactions demand for money which came out of cost minimization function. Now, here we are going to discuss separate cases or different issues related with the same model, aiming to understand the transactions demand for money better. And on one hand, we found out that transactions demand for money depends on three factors, that is brokerage costs, income, and interest rate. The question which interests us is the sensitivities or elasticities of each factor, and also different cases that happens in the real life, and how can we explain. So what we note, on one hand, we know that income is an important factor um, for a demand for money. But what we sometimes notice that people with less income, their demand for money is higher than people with higher income, and that somehow that is not linked so directly with the findings of the first model, which proved income to have a positive elasticity with the demand for money. And in order to understand that, we are going to take now a bit different approach. We are going to look at the profits of holding bonds. So that is probably a person who decides to hold bonds instead of keeping cash. If he or she thinks that they could earn. And so what determines the profits of bonds? So first of all, we can write the profit function, which is going to be income or interest income from bonds minus cost, which is mainly brokerage cost, as we face them when we need to withdraw the money from bonds to cash. And so we can replace it with functions. Interest income is interest rate times the value of bonds, and minus brokerage costs, which we define it in the first part of the lecture. By substituting the values, we also found out that bonds is half of income minus quantity of money, and substituting the optimal withdrawals that we found out in the equilibrium, we get this profit function. Looking for the decisions, or aiming to understand the decisions, we try to maximize this profit function by calculating its first order derivative and making it equal to 0. And so finding out what would be transactions demand for money and transactions demand for bonds would be. So on one hand, we get exactly the same function, a very similar function that we did previously. But if we put the value of money and optimal value of money and optimal value of bonds in this profit function, that's what we would say. This would give us the optimal profit we can get and what affects it. So when it is profitable to have bonds, even though a person makes this profit maximizing decisions, it might be that it's really unprofitable to have any bonds. So when it is profitable, looking at the equation, we can easily see that the first component should be higher than the second one, or should be at least not equal to 0. And this happens if this value in the brackets would not be is greater than 0. And this can be possible only if the interest rate in bonds is at least twice higher than the brokerage costs. So one of the logical actually explanations on why do people buy short-term financial assets even though we know that we're gonna need that money quite quickly for paying for their expenditure, is that interest that is offered, or the possibility of interest of possible interests are so high that it compensates all the inconvenience and actual transaction costs that we face in order to make those financial transactions. So in case interest on bonds is very low or equal to 0, we would see people holding cash instead of buying short-term financial assets, because it's not so profitable. It does not compensate all the work you need to do, and so we will see that in general the transactions demand for money is higher, as people doesn't, as, let's say, short-term financial assets doesn't seem to be so attractive. The other case when this circumstances may not happen is when B1 or brokerage cost is very high, which means that even though, let's say, in the entire country, the interest rates on bonds is quite attractive, and official costs, brokerage costs, are not so high, but we can always find some people who, for example, have personal high costs, like they don't have internet at home. They live in a village somewhere in the forest, let's say, and in order to do those financial transactions, in order to buy short-term financial assets and then withdraw them in cash, we need to travel somewhere far away. We need to spend much of their time, and that simply is so inconvenient that their brokerage cost becomes very high. And that's why people would decide to have more cash and not to buy any bonds. This may happen for particular people in even very developed countries, but also this is very much linked, brokerage costs are very much linked with the general development level of financial sector and financial network in the country. If it's very good developed and people are of a high financial literacy, usually brokerage costs are very low. The other possible case of negative profits, or when it is not profitable to hold bonds, is when income is very low. So the first component becomes very low, despite it doesn't matter what is the interest rate and what is the brokerage cost. It simply doesn't, the total earnings doesn't compensate the cost they experience, or actual alternative cost of holding money. So when income is very low, for people, it doesn't seem to be profitable to hold bonds, and so they simply hold everything in cash. And in the case of low income, we observe the transactions demand for money being higher. That's again a question. On one hand, we have when we have this finding, we can imagine two different cases. We can imagine countries with different income level. And so in countries with lower income level, we probably should expect transactions demand for money to be higher, as simply there are more people for whom it's not profitable to hold bonds. But on the other hand, in each other country, we have different people with different income level. And the next question is, what is the effect of income distribution in a country on the transactions demand for money. For doing that, for understanding that, we can imagine two different countries. We can imagine country A, where income distribution is very uneven, where one person holds all the income of a country, and then the others holds or has nothing. In country B, the income distribution is perfectly even, which means each citizen has the same amount of income. And so we can find, right, this, what we derived, this is transactions demand for money for the particular person. So we can write it and multiply by the number of citizens in the country in order to find out the total transactions demand for money. Though, as in the first country, there's only one person who gets income and he gets everything. So entire transactions demand for money in that country is his personal transactions demand for money. And so that's why we see that transactions demand for money in the country is very similar to the previous equilibrium levels. For the B economy, as each person gets not all the income but just a share of it, which is y divided by n. So this is one person's transactions demand for money, and as there are n number of individuals in that country, we multiply it by n, so aiming to find out the total transactions demand for money. If we transform the function, we would get this value, and the power of 1 second multiplied by the transactions demand for money, which is exactly the same as in A country. And what does this finding say? It says that in B country, the transactions demand for money is going to be higher. Which gives us a suggestion that more even distribution of income leads to higher transactions demand for money compared with the countries with the worse income distribution. Honestly, when we talk about particular countries, these transactions demand for money should be estimated separately, because none of the countries are like A or B. They all are somewhere in between. And then there are many questions which we need to discuss. Is what, even though the income distribution may not be that even, but then what is the level of the poor, what is the income level of the poorest people? Is it enough to hold to get profits from holding obligation bonds? So they would that people still would buy bonds, and that in transactions from demand for money would be lower. Or are the poorest people so poor that they actually cannot afford to buy any financial asset, and so they hold everything in cash? That would affect, that would have an important difference in the transactions for demand for money, even though the income distribution might be very similar in two different countries. The other issues, again, related with that is the general income level of a country. So that is what happens when income is growing. How the transactions demand for money changes when income is growing or when economy is developing. So what is the effect of economic development on the transactions demand for money? For understanding that, we are going to assume that in any country, there is a eta share of population that has enough income to hold one's profitability, and 1 minus alpha, which is a fraction of population that does not find it profitable to hold bonds. So they have all the money in cash. So which means then if we try to write down the total transactions demand for money in the country. It's gonna have two components. One is transactions demand for money of the people, of the better off people, and the other is the transactions demand for money of poor people. As poor people doesn't find it profitable to buy any bonds, so all their income, YB, is kept in cash. And then if as these better off people, they buy bonds, so their demand for money has more components. It has interest rate, and it also has brokerage costs. This doesn't explain us a lot how the transaction demand for money changes, but if we try to model different situations with equation, this is probably what we would find. First of all, that as the economy is developing and so income is growing, so what we saw also that growth of income has a positive effect on the demand for money. So demand for money should be growing too. But if this growth of income leads to the fact that the number of poor people is decreasing, and so alpha increases, so that the share of population which holds bonds because it becomes profitable is increasing, so then income becomes of a lower important factor with a lower importance. On the other hand, economic development is linked with financial development of a country, and this financial development reduces the brokerage costs. It makes it more attractive and more cheap for people to do financial transactions, and that's why even people with lower income may find it more attractive and profitable already to hold bonds. And so the transactions demand for money has the change of transactions demand for money has two side changes. On one hand, it might be growing because of higher income, but on the other hand, as income increases and the economy is developing and financial sector is developing, more people find it profitable to hold bonds, and the transactions demand for money is decreasing. So what we see that economic development may affect transactions demand for money in both ways. It depends which effect is bigger and more important in particular country. The other important observation when talking about the linkage between economic development and transactions demand for money is the changes of elasticities, that is the importance of factors. Interest rate elasticity is increasing and income elasticity is decreasing as economy is developing. And that again could be explained by similar arguments that you already heard, that as more together with economic development, more people find it profitable to buy bonds, interest rate becomes more important factor, or its importance becomes bigger, as there are more people who would make their decision about how much cash to hold, looking at the interest rates in the market. While income becomes of a less importance for the transactions demand for money, as even though the income is growing, people simply would not there would be more people finding it profitable to hold bonds, and so the transactions demand for money would not increase that much because of its positive changes of the income. So what we can expect that in the lower developed countries, income changes would be of a bigger importance for the transactions demand for money, and in the more developed countries, interest rate would be of a bigger importance for the transaction demand for money. one more issue I want to discuss with you is a firm's perspective. On one hand, we said that um, again, also firms are important in the transactions demand for money because they also lower costs when having cash. And from this perspective, the case of firm and the case of the household or individual seems to be very similar. And companies would be doing very similar decisions as the households do, as how much bonds to buy, and looking at their interest rates and brokerage costs that they occur. But we can discuss a separate case with the firms, which is not common for individuals. We can find different companies in the world. One of them have their money management very centralized in the head office. The other companies have it decentralized when each of the branch makes a decisions separately. So what is the difference? We can consider a firm with its total income Y, having n number of identical branches, and each of a branch earns the same amount, so its total income of a company is divided equally into each of a branch, and Y divided by N is income of each branch. And we can model the situation when the money management is centralized and when it is not centralized, how the transactions demand for money would be different. And actually, we already had a very similar case when we talked about income distribution. And case of the centralized case would lead us or give us the answer, which is the same as in the case of uneven income distribution in the country. And perfectly decentralized case would give us an answer as a perfectly even distribution of income in the country. So, which means that if we have more companies which are perfectly decentralized in money management, the transactions demand for money could be higher. While if we have companies which prefer to have centralized money management, the transactions demand for money would be lower. There are a few more case issues to mention here. First of all, that centralization of the funds management actually leads to higher efficiency and cost saving and allows the company to earn bigger profits, and that's why it might seem to be attractive. But on the other hand, decentralization is more convenient, it saves time, it helps for bookkeeping, and increases security. And that's why probably as both of the cases have very important positive sides, we have in most companies, they have partly centralized or partly decentralized funds management, where something some decisions could be made in branches and some decisions should be made in the central office. And so but on the other hand, the transactions demand for money, or the differences in the transactions demand for money, could be explained sometimes by knowing what policies in the funds management companies have. Yeah. Okay, so now remember that assumption that we did in the very beginning of the lecture about that all the payments are made in cash or are made in money. In this modern world, very often we pay by debit cards, which is not cash, and then so we can question um, how it affects the transactions demand for money, or is there any difference if we have cash or if we make payments directly via debit cards. So we're gonna say demand deposits for the all the funds that are in our debit cards. As demand deposits means that it's not cash, it's somewhere in the bank, but you can get it as soon as you ask, as you need. And so it is very, very liquid form of deposits. So now we assume that all money people have are in demand deposits. So there's no cash. So everybody has their money in the debit cards. Then R is going to be interest on bonds as usually, and RD is going to be interest on demand deposits. So we could actually earn some interest if we have money in a debit card instead of having cash. So again, making a decision how much money to have as bonds and how much money to leave in a debit card or as demand deposit, we think about profit we can earn. And so profits is going to be profits on bonds plus profits or incomes on demand deposits. And minus brokerage costs when we need to transfer bonds to demand deposits. Aiming to find out what would be the optimum value of a demand deposit. For transactions, we need to find the first order derivative of profit function in respect of deposits, make it equal to 0, and then we can calculate the optimal value of the demand deposit for transaction motives. And we also can calculate the substituting that, we can calculate the optimal bonds value that we would have. Putting it back into profit function, we put it back into profit function, or making a deeper analysis of what we found, you see the difference between transactions demand for demand deposits and the transactions demand for cash or for money is only here when we have this interest rate variable. For the cash, we had only interest rate on bonds, which was important. Now it's also interest rates on demand deposits, which plays a role. And it's not themselves separately, but they are different. What does it say? It says that if interest rate on demand deposit, the difference between interest rates on bonds and interest rates on demand deposits is going to be very small, then people would simply keep more money in demand deposits. In order people to transfer more money into into bonds, into financial assets, the interest rates on bonds should be way higher than the interest rates on deposits. Here I want to draw one more thing, coming back to the real life and the actual situation. We need to think whether we really get interest on our demand deposits. At the moment of this low interest rate period, this interest rate on bonds is low, but also interest rates on demand deposits is actually equal to 0. At least in Lithuania, I don't know any commercial bank which would pay interests on the funds which you have in your debit card, which means, so in this case, when RD becomes equal to 0, we can treat demand for demand deposits exactly the same as transactions demand for money. And from this perspective, it has no difference. From this perspective, it actually leads to no difference whether we have money for making transactions in cash or whether we have money for making transactions in demand deposits. So in general, when in all these small cases that we discussed here, when I come to talk about the actual situation in the today world, we have some changes and adjustments because of development of financial sector and innovations, or special technological innovations in financial sector leads to changes in the how we make a transaction, and this changes the transactions demand for money. Here are 5 major innovations in financial sector listed. First of all, creation of new types of financial assets and increasing liquidity of some of existing assets, which says that as liquidity of the financial assets increases, or there are more attractive products offered in the market, people could find it more profitable to earn bonds, to hold bonds instead of holding cash. And so they would simply transfer more of their funds into bonds, and demand for money could be lower. Then we have these innovations on deposit and withdrawal mechanisms when it's not that costly. So the brokerage costs are decreasing as simply it becomes more convenient to withdraw money or to put a deposit or to deposit them. And so again, as it becomes more convenient and the brokerage cost decreases, the transactions demand for money should be lower. And we have changes or innovations in the payment means, development of different cards, which helps us to make or allows us to make payments very quickly and sometimes even directly, which again decreases brokerage costs in terms of timing, and also in case if we don't need to involve a third party in making transaction, also it decreases the transaction costs in monetary terms. And the development of online payments, which leads to the fact that we do much of the transactions by ourselves at home, and we can actually pay without having any cash, nor even sometimes having debit card, but just simply by making a transaction online. This again reduces the brokerage costs and also makes bonds to be more attractive. So all these technological innovations leads to decreasing transactions demand for money, which makes it easier for people to make payments, makes it cheaper for people to make payments directly, and we need less and less cash, or other alternatives of not holding cash becomes more attractive. For the end, I want to, there's an issue about estimation of the money demand. And we talked a lot about different cases, how the transaction demand for money changes, and why it might be different, and how to understand it. In all the cases, we had this formula to explain the transactions demand for money. The difference between those two is that the upper is a nominal, it has a p-value, and the lower is a real transactions demand for money without prices, a component of prices. So in all those cases, we had this transactions demand for money function, which is like Cobb-Douglas function. And which shows that the relations between indicators are not linear. And so which means that if we aim to estimate it, if we aim to make empirical estimation, it becomes not that easy. So as most of the econometrical instruments asks or are applicable for linear relationships. How to get a linear relation? The mathematical instrument to make a function linear is logarithms. So when we log each of the variable, uh, the function might become linear, and then it could be easily applicable to many empirical investigations. The coefficients beta, which we have now, they are going to represent the efficiencies or the linkages between the factor and the transactions demand for money. And estimating these linkages, these factors, we would know how strong is the relationship, or what is the importance of a particular factor of the transactions demand for money in a particular country. So thank you.